Welcome, action fans, and thanks for joining us for another edition of All 90s Action All the Time as we continue this year's journey looking at the best and worst action movies of 1994. I'm your host, Scott Murphy, and on today's show, we are discussing a personal favorite action movie of mine in The Crow. Alongside me to talk about this one, we have some very special guests in the form of SpyHards hosts, Special Agents Scott and Cam. Welcome both to the podcast.
Thank you so much for
Hello.
having us.
Hello there. Yes, thank you for having us aboard.
That's no problem at all. So, yeah, before we get into the movie, before we get into the Crow, and I give the stats for the Crow. Talk us a little bit through Spy Hearts and how it came about and what you've been doing over there in the spy realm.
Well,
Scott?
thank you, Cam. Thank you for setting me up. I'll do it all. No worries. It's not connected to the Crow at all. I can't think of any sort of particularly funny segue into it. Hang on. It's Black Ops.
Oh, pretty good. That's pretty good.
That's
All
pretty
right.
good. Pretty good.
So, the Spy Hards podcast, every week we look at a different spy movie throughout the annals of film history, all the way back to the silent movie era, all the way up to the modern era with, things like the James Bond films, Mission Impossible, stuff like that. Plus, we look at, some TV shows on the Patreon. And then in between those, we interview a lot of people that were in your favorite spy movies. We've had names on the show like Denise Richards, Colin Salmon, Jacqueline Bisset, a couple of big names coming out this year that I won't spoil as well. But yeah, lots to do. And we really love doing these interviews as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, that sounds great, and I've definitely listened to some of your interviews and some of your episodes, and I definitely recommend our listeners to check it out. And it clearly shows what a good podcaster I am. That in a season that we're covering True Lies, Clear and Present Danger, Leon, I brought you on for The Crow. Oh, anyway, which makes clearly perfect sense.
Well, hang on. I can fix this for you.
Yeah.
We talk about spy movies every week. Okay. We've got those credentials. We don't need to prove them, but you're letting us spread our wings.
Right. Yes.
Oh, well,
The Crow,
yeah,
a
no,
bird.
I got it.
Yeah.
I got
Okay.
it. I got it.
I'll try
I
to
got it.
drive it home.
It was a good. It was a good pun. It was a good pun. I liked it. And yes, it makes me look better as well because like I now it looks like I've been generous and been like, well, yeah, to briefly come off the spy train and talk about something else for a little while.
We've
Um,
spoken about those films. You can listen to us talk about them on the show. This we
Mm-hmm.
haven't spoken about.
yeah. I mean, like, yeah, and that's true. I mean, like, why cover something twice when you can cover something completely new? And before, actually, I'll do the stats first, and then we'll talk about your history with the Crow, if you have one.
People once believed that when someone dies, a crow carries their soul to the land of the dead. But sometimes, just sometimes, the crow can bring that soul back to put the wrong things right.
You're all going to die.
Is that gasoline I smell?
Victims, aren't we all?
So, today's film was released on May 13th, 1994. It was directed by Alex Proyas, who's most known for the likes of Dark City and I, Robot. It was written by David Jai Chow. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. Or Shao. He is mainly a novelist, but he has a number of screenwriting credits, mainly in the horror realm, which includes the likes of Leatherface, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, Texas Chainsaw Massacre The Beginning, and Critters 3 and 4. It
Not the
was also
best Texas Chainsaws, I gotta say.
not the highest peaks of that franchise. No.
No, no.
Um, it was also written by John Shirley, who is again mainly a novelist, that only has one other film screenwriting credit, but does have a number of screenwriting credits when it comes to cartoons, where he has written for the likes of Defenders of the Earth, The Real Ghostbusters, Brave Star, Spawn the Animated Series, and Batman Beyond. And it was also based on the comic book of the same name, which was written by James O. Barr. Critically, it is currently sitting on a 7.5 out of 10 on IMDb, 84% on Rotten Tomatoes based on 63 reviews. It's got a 71 on Metacritic based on 17 reviews, and a 3.7 on Letterboxd. Box office wise, according to the website The Numbers, it made $51 million off of a $23 million budget, making it the 31st biggest film of 1994, placing it just behind the live action version of The Jungle Book and just ahead of Naked Gun 33 and a third, The Final Insult. A strange triple bill.
1994 in a nutshell. Those three movies. That pretty much says it all.
Yeah. Yeah, 1994, a good year for bad third parts and franchises, because it also was the year that Beverly Hills Cop 3 came out. So,
Oof.
and
Oof.
that is the
Yeah.
correct reaction to Beverly Hills Cop 3.
And that's the year of the Flintstones, right? As well.
Yes. And
Oof.
I think that people forget because I always look up the box office numbers for each of the films that we're covering, and each of the time I look at the worldwide box office for 1994 and see that the Flintstones was like the third biggest film of 1994. It blows my mind.
Well, I remember that summer, and it was like, okay, the big movies are going to be like The Flintstones, Beverly Hills Cop 3, and I remember there was a lot of hype around the Woody Harrelson, Kiefer Sutherland film, The Cowboy Way. People, that's what we were dealing with in 1994 summer movie season.
That's true. That's true. But we also got like a lot of good films, because this season we're mainly covering good films, like this film and True Lies and
Hmm.
Leon, and there's a lot of good stuff.
There was
um
Speed. Speed's like a
Speed.
classic, so that's that
Speed,
year as well.
we've covered. Yeah, we covered Speed. That's the episode. As we record, the episode's not out, but as this episode come out, the episode will be out, so we'll have covered Speed by the time this episode comes out.
What a tease.
Yes, a future past tease.
Mm.
Yeah, work that one out. So I don't know which one of you wants to go first. Maybe because Scott took the SpyHards description. Maybe Cam. What is your relationship to The Crow? Have you seen it before? What is your kind of general thoughts on it, without kind of spoiling too much on your thoughts for the rest of the record?
Yeah. So I hadn't really had that much of a relationship with The Crow. I saw it pretty much right when it hit home video, so that probably would have been probably 1995. I remember watching it at a friend's house as a teenager and enjoying it and being really into that specific time period, which is like your post Batman period, where you've got Dick Tracy and of course Batman Returns, and there's a lot of studios trying to figure out how to make these comic book movies that the kids seem to like. And The Crow kind of falls into that, and it feels like a very kind of appropriate movie when you watch it now. You can kind of see how it has one foot in that post 89 era, but also it's leaning towards where we're going to go before you get to like X-Men in 2000. Like there's a lot of Blade in this movie as well. So you can kind of see how it influenced things and also how it was influenced by other films. So I think it's actually a very interesting film. It's not one though that like it's hard for me to say that I have a kind of lifelong love affair with The Crow the way I do with like Batman Returns. Like Batman Returns of that time period is like my go-to superhero movie.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Which is a great movie. It's definitely high up there on my list of kind of favorite favorite superhero movies.
When they were
Um,
doing the Dutch angle shots of the gravestones in this movie, I was like, "Oh, that's straight from Batman Returns." That shot, you could feel kind of it
mm.
drawing a little bit upon that Tim Burton influence.
Yes, I noticed that as well. Like, for some reason, I've watched the Crow is kind of a favorite of mine, and I've watched it a number of times. But for some reason, that hit home to me more on this rewatch. Kind of how much it kind of sits in that kind of Batman Returns realm. Like, there's a lot of Batman Returns DNA in this movie for sure.
Yeah, and even some Edward Scissorhands as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think the whole design of the city, and like it being this kind of hellish, kind of gothic other scape. Yeah, it's very Burton-esque, and for
Hmm.
some reason, I kind of thought of it as kind of its unique own thing. But yeah, no, there's a lot of Burton in here for sure. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and no people on the streets. Also a Burton standard.
Yeah, yeah. Very, very empty. Very. I mean, it's guess people are inside because it's raining all the time. You know, that's uh, Scott. What's your kind of relationship with the film, if you have one?
Well, it's tough for me because this was actually the first time I've ever watched the film
Oh,
for the show, but I do have a relationship with the film, and it goes back to probably about 1998, so a few years afterwards. But I specifically remember I was maybe 12 or 13, and for Halloween I dressed up as Sting from WCW
yeah.
with the face paint and everything, trench coat. And a number of the adults at the party were like, "Hey, are you the Crow?" I'm like, "No, I'm Sting." I didn't really understand for a long time until I saw pictures of the Crow and realized that that's actually where the design for Sting came from.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
like hanging in the rafters and all that sort of stuff. Sort of the iconography of the Sting character, well, that evolution of Sting comes from the Crow. And so I just never really made time to watch it, and until this opportunity came along, I was like, "Hey, this is perfect. Let's pop it in and give it a watch."
Are you going to now watch all the sequels as well? Because I have done that.
I think I'll just watch Sting WCW matches instead.
Probably a wiser choice.
That is a wiser choice. That's interesting. So you have seen the sequels.
Oh, I've seen the City of Angels. I've experienced salvation, and I have lived through Wicked Prayer.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I've seen Salvation. I've definitely seen City of Angels. Weirdly, I had because I was really into The Crow. I got really into it. Got the comic book. I had the I had the original movie on VHS. I also bought City of Angels on VHS. Very excited about that.
Hmm.
Yeah, and then I watched it and I was not as excited. Although I do. It was a long time since I've seen City of Angels, but the one thing I do remember enjoying about it was Iggy Pop gives a wacky performance, and that's about it. Other than
Yeah,
that, it's terrible. But like,
yeah. You've got a like really fantastic, villain charismatic performance from Iggy Pop, but other than that, it's dire. But that said, you watch City of Angels and then realize that it's all downhill from there because like Salvation and Wicked Prayer are just wretched, just unbelievably terrible. And you've got like Edward Furlong playing the Crow in Wicked
I was
Prayer.
just gonna say, isn't Edward Furlong in one of them?
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
right. That's right. Wicked. I've definitely seen Wicked Prayer. That's the Edward Furlong, David Boreanaz one. Which I'm sure both
David
of them.
Boreanaz. Oh
Yeah.
God.
The third one has a good soundtrack. I'll say that for it.
When did
Yeah.
that come out?
Sometime in the mid 2000s, I think.
I think
Wicked
it's
Prayer.
like 2001 or something. 2001,
Perfect,
2002.
perfect new
Yeah,
metal
something. Something.
time.
Oh yes, it
Hmm.
is. It is. It
Yeah,
is.
right.
It's early 2000s. No, actually, no, I was right. It was 2005.
Is it
So
really that late? Okay.
yeah, yeah. So Crow Salvation was 2000, but yeah, it's not until 2005. I mean, what? I mean, how can you resist? What a cast! Edward Furlong, Tara Reid, and David Boreanaz. I mean,
Oh, Wicked Prayer. That one's 2005, right?
yeah,
Salvation's the
Wicked
one with
Prayer.
the good soundtrack. Salvation is a
Salvation,
good soundtrack.
Salvation,
Yeah.
yes, Salvation is the one with a good soundtrack. Yeah, Salvation is that is 2000. Um,
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you're not wrong. I'm looking at it, to be fair. It's got like Hole, Kid Rock, Monster Magnet, Filter, Crystal Method, Static X. That's a pretty good lineup.
Yeah, it is. And I think Kirsten Dunst is in that movie as well.
Yes, she is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And like I don't know, the guy who plays the crow in that one, I don't really know him.
Vince. Oh no, that's oh, I can't even. Oh, Eric Mabius, right? He's
Eric
he's
Mabius.
not good. He is not good in that movie.
No, he is not. He's not the. Yeah, he's not the best. Not the
And
best
notably,
actor.
there was a TV show too from '98 to '99 called The Crow Stairway to Heaven. I never saw it, but that had Mark Dacascos as the Crow, and Dacascos is great. He showed up in John Wick Chapter 3, for example, and he was great.
Yeah, I really like DeCascos. The first we might cover it next year. The first DeCascos film I saw was Crying Freeman, which is a fun kind of movie that's based on like an anime, I think. But yeah, DeCascos is great, and he's a great kind of martial artist and stuff like that. So,
And I can tie it all back. Mark Dacascos started Double Dragon, which came out in 1994, the year of the Crow.
boom! That's podcasting for you. That's gold.
Well, I'm out, folks. I'll see you later. That's my take on the Crow.
You can't top that. That's no. You've done it. You've completed podcasting. You can retire easy now. So I've got questions for Scott. Because
Okay.
this is very interesting to me because I think I love this movie. And I guess part of my love for the movie is I grew up in the 90s, and like, I think all the design of this movie, the kind of Burton-esque thing, the fact that like half the movie looks like a Soundgarden video, all the very 90 version of cool, that all works for me. And also I first saw it when I was like 14.
Hmm.
So but now you're seeing it much later in life. I wondered how your initial response to it was, because like you don't have all that, and I do think that seeing this is one of those movies that seeing it in your teens really elevates it. Is my theory.
Well, it's interesting. I know, obviously, your show is about the 90s and sort of
Yeah,
a nostalgic feel for the 90s. And nostalgia can be a very powerful thing, but it can also be quite blinding at times.
yeah, sure.
I've found in the past. And so one thing I found a lot of enjoyment, especially with the show, our show, SpyHards, is going back to films I've watched before, specifically from the 90s, stuff like GoldenEye, for instance,
Mhm.
and coming back at it with more of a critical eye instead of looking at it from this sort of warm blanket. This is just what I watched on VHS a bunch of times and played on N64. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So coming at this as like a blank slate, I was worried I would be hypercritical of it and sort of work it down to the sort of nubs. But I had a really good time with it. I think there is a solid film here, and I think the cream will always rise to the top despite of nostalgia. And I think this is a very good film.
Yes. And I was a little bit worried because like I've watched this film many times, but it's been maybe about 10 years since I last watched it, so I was like, oh, I don't know. But I think it actually holds up really well. I think like the major thing that has changed in my relationship to this movie, I would say that when I was a teenager, I thought it was more profound than it is, like in terms of
Mm.
it's dealing with grief and the kind of the whole kind of grand kind of gothic romance of it all. I thought it was a deeper film than it actually is, and it's not a deep film at all. But I think it's still really, like in terms of the visuals, in terms of the performances, in terms of the act, like yeah, I said the performances, but like in terms of the action is what I was meaning to say there. I think like it all really holds up actually really well.
Yeah,
It
I
has,
don't think this is walking out as like a 5-star instant classic, but
Mm.
it's got all the hallmarks of, as Cab said, this era of sort of gothic style superhero filmmaking.
Mm.
But it has an edge to it that I've not really seen in many other places, and I just appreciate sort of how earnest it all is. It's not winking at the camera, hasn't gone to that self-referential comic book films that we get nowadays where everything's a laugh. It took itself very seriously, and it reminded me of stuff around the time, like Spawn and things like that. it just took me back into the 90s. And you know, I was maybe not, I was a Soundgarden fan, but like I was well into stuff like The Matrix and films like that. It's like the other end of the decade.
Yeah.
And this gave me vibes of that. I just loved wearing leather trench coats, man.
It has sort of like a gothic Romeo and Juliet feel to
Yeah.
it. And you know, that's a very earnest story as well, Romeo and Juliet. And what, 2 years later, there would be like that big you know, generation defining version of that story with DiCaprio and Claire Danes. So it feels like it's kind of landing in that kind of 90s gothic romanticism that I think is really effective. It's like Scott and I often talk about the show or on our show about movies that have like are kind of timeless. And then
Mm.
there's ones that are very specifically within their time period. And I think The Crow is so bang on its time period, but in a wonderful way. It is a time capsule to stuff that I really appreciated about that era, which is that kind of, you know, gothic comic book storytelling and, you know, heavily tinged with film noir, which I will always enjoy. And I mourn the days of when we got lots of that stuff and now we don't get them so much anymore. I think The Spirit was the last stab at that, and it was boy, was
Terrible.
that a chore. Um, sorry, Frank Miller, but yeah, like
You don't need to apologize to Frank Miller.
that's true.
He's written some good stuff, but he's a terrible person.
Yeah, true enough, true enough. But no, like this movie, I like, you know, that it was underlined. I think Scott, my co-host, said where it's like it has an R-rated edge to it, which a lot of these movies didn't. You know, Batman, Dick Tracy, they all kind of like danced in that PG-13 kind of world. Whereas like The Crow, right from the first shot, it is like a fiery hellscape. And the movie just submerges you into that for, you know, an hour and 40 minutes. And it's really violent in a way that often reminded me of RoboCop. It has that kind of Paul Verhoeven cackling
Hmm.
villains who are just completely psychotic. Um, and it's, you know, it is pretty unrelenting in its revenge quest for its hero. It does not pull punches. It definitely delivers in terms of like visceral violence, but it never kind of loses sight of the emotional core of the story.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. And I think you've raised a lot of interesting points there. One that I wanted to get back to Scott on, was what she was saying that it reminded him there's kind of elements of the Matrix. One of the interesting things is Andrew Mason, who was the VFX supervisor on this movie, would go on to work on the Matrix films. So
Uh,
there is a Matrix connection there. Yeah.
Well, there's
Um,
also you mentioned the director Alex Proyas, who went on to do Dark City, which for a lot of people is kind of a precursor to the Matrix in itself.
mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. So there is, and this was kind of the high time for like, because like you say, there's elements of a bunch of stuff going on here because like the year after, you know, you get things like Johnny Mnemonic and you know, and then like there's Dark City and then there's a Matrix, and so we're getting into this like this 90s period of like cyberpunk like being a big thing. And so like you're getting all these different elements of like there's elements from like the music scenes of like grunge and metal, there's elements of like the gothicness of Burton, there's the kind of early kind of cyberpunk kind of look. And I think like it's interesting you mentioned that kind of RoboCop reference because obviously James O'Barr, who wrote the original comic book, is a Detroit native, and again, so like we're just suggesting generally with RoboCop in this movie that Detroit is this kind of hellscape on Earth.
Yeah, I've never been to Detroit, but they don't do a great job with tourism, I gotta say, in promoting tourism in these films, but I'll get there one day.
Yeah. It would have been like my co-host Craig couldn't make it today, but it would have been interesting if he was on this record because like he is from Ann Arbor in Michigan, which is near Detroit. So it would have been interesting to see what he felt about how Michigan is portrayed on screen.
Another influence I kept thinking about too is like we talked about Tim Burton, but Tim Burton brings more of a like, you know, kind of art driven style to his
Mhm.
films, right? Like that's more
Yeah.
of his fixation. That and kind of like pulp movies and, you know, campy television. Like that's kind of what he draws on. But this movie has MTV all over it. And this is like that big explosion of MTV popularity and music videos. You can see when you're seeing, for example, like the flying crow POV, like those filters on that remind me of music videos of the period. And that is something that to me makes this one feel special, is that you wouldn't say that about Dick Tracy or the Tim Burton Batmans or The Shadow with, Alec Baldwin. Like this one feels very MTV influenced, and that's something you'll see obviously in The Matrix as well. But to me, like, just seeing the scenes in like the goth clubs and hearing Nine Inch Nails on the soundtrack, I'm like, this is like that key point too, where it's like we are tipping from grunge music into more of the industrial stuff of Nine Inch Nails. Marilyn Manson's coming out in 94 as well. So it's like we're kind of headed in that direction, which is interesting when you talk about leading into things like Johnny Mnemonic and The Matrix, where suddenly it's kind of similar type of storytelling, but infusing more technology, which is what industrial music was doing.
Yeah, I absolutely. And I do think I think you're absolutely right there, and I think obviously that is because Alex Proyas, before he started directing movies like this, he was a music video director, and I think often with music video directors you can see um, that that background. And something I wanted to kind of circle back to, I think it was Scott, you mentioned it, was the kind of earnestness of this film, and I think it is earnest, but I think it's an interesting mixture that we don't get now. So like there's like two settings for comic book movies. Basically there is the Marvel setting, which is like that kind of wedding-esque kind of, meta humor, self-regimental winking. And then there's like the kind of there's like the Nolan Snyder setting, which is like almost completely devoid of humor. Whereas this tells you what you need to take seriously, but also has humor within it. With the kind of one-liners and some of the gags that like Eric Draven is kind of doing while he's killing the guys, and there is some kind of deliberately over the top moments, like when David Patrick Kelly's character is saying that Tintin is the first one to die. He's like he was stabbed in all his major organs in alphabetical order. Which there's like a knowing absurdity to some of the lines in the movie, and I think it's an interesting balance that just doesn't seem to happen anymore. I was wondering what your thought might be on that.
Well, see, it's an interesting one because you are going by your definition of the sort of two groups of superhero movies, and there are things that I would say probably skirt those lines going between them. But I think of something like Batman '89 versus Batman Begins.
Mm.
You can't argue that Michael Keaton or Christian Bale are not taking the role seriously. But the worlds they inhabit are very different worlds. Batman Begins is very grounded. It's almost as if Batman could exist around us right now, whereas the world that Michael Keaton's Batman is in is still hyper realized and there's hyper violence, all kinds of stuff going on. That's the same thing as in The Crow. They're both very earnest performances as Batmans, but the worlds around them are different. This has the same thing as sort of the Batman '89, where you've got the sort of very serious protagonist, but the world around him is a fantasy. And so I think that's why you don't really get that anymore, which I think that's really what I think you're trying to get at.
Yeah, I guess so. Yep.
What I also thought about with Batman '89 as well is that like that movie, this movie isn't really like driven by momentum. It's more of an atmosphere piece. And it really is just like kind of like an assemblage of scenes that you kind of like soak up. And it's not like say like the Nolan movies, which are much more like plot driven. They are definitely driving in terms of their momentum. And like I think of so many scenes in Batman '89. It's like Jack Nicholson in a room talking to like one of his thugs. And that's a scene. And then we cut to something going on with Batman, and that is a scene. And that's kind of the way The Crow works too, where it's a lot of scenes of just like Michael Wincott and Bai Ling in a room, just being crazy. And then we cut back to what's going on with The Crow. And it just is more interested in having you just sit back and kind of be absorbed into the world versus kind of pushing you through the world.
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you mentioned there about the atmosphere, Cam, because I think I think you're right that that's kind of the main thing of the movie, the kind of the atmosphere of the movie, and also the kind of the emotion of the tale, and um like we talked about the kind of gothic romance and all that. Because like I have to say that reading some of the like letterbox reviews and stuff like that, one of the kind of criticisms that I saw like a few times was some people, and I think this is almost beside the point, but I think for some people they thought there was like a lack of stakes because Eric is like essentially kind of invincible throughout the movie up until like basically the last scene, and these like goons like have kind of no chance against them. But I never felt that was never a thing that let the film down for me. I don't know what it was. Did that affect your viewing experience, either of you?
Well, I would agree that a film needs stakes.
Mm-hmm.
I understand that your protagonist needs to be flawed, but I don't think him killing those people has really anything to do with his story. Like it's more, I suppose vengeance is his story. Maybe that's a bad point. But like I don't think them getting an upper hand on him has any sort of it wouldn't resolve the story. It's about him getting revenge and finding peace.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's with bullets or swords or whatever, then so be it. But like, I don't think him being like an immortal being is a down mark to the film because I don't really think it's about him being in peril.
No, I mean, they keep referring to him as a ghost, and it's basically a ghost with unfinished business.
Yeah.
And that is what he's doing. And I do think, though, in terms of like, as you say, stakes, there's a reason that they have the little girl there to get
Hmm.
kidnapped by the end. Like that is to introduce a little bit of peril because they probably felt like they needed something when you got towards the end face off with Michael Wincott. But for most of the movie, does it matter? I think like one of the things they do to kind of dance around that as well is the introduction of the Ernie Hudson police officer.
Yeah.
Such a
Yeah.
trope of superhero movies of this time period. You can go back to the reporters in Batman '89 with Vicky Vale and Alexander Knox, but
Mm-hmm.
a lot of these movies would inject a reporter or a police officer whose job it was to kind of track what was going on with your fairly um, isolated superhero because the hero often didn't have anyone to talk to. So they would have a character that was basically filling in the blanks for the audience and guiding them into that world. I think a lot about Joe Pantoliano in Daredevil, a movie that I don't think anyone holds in any great regard, the Ben Affleck film. But
That's true.
that movie owes a lot to this movie as well. And you even have a scene where they're lighting gasoline on the floor and it's showing the hero's, insignia on the ground in flames. And again, it's like that concept of kind of your every man or every woman type of character that is sort of your entry point. I think that's where they're relying a little more on Ernie Hudson to give the audience something to connect to because you don't need necessarily your hero to be in danger the whole time.
It's not even that. You look at, say, Sergeant Powell in Die Hard. So
Yeah.
even outside of
Uh,
comic book films, it's still happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, big time. Yeah.
yeah, where the protagonist has like a kind of it's not really a sidekick, I guess, but like yeah, somebody who is kind of tracking their steps.
It allows them to restack the plot a lot of
Yeah,
the time, so they can go like, "Oh, you need to get up to the next floor," and
Mm-hmm.
then he knows. Then the audience knows that's what the objective is for our protagonist, and that's what's driving them for the next sequence.
Heck,
yeah,
even the 1989 Punisher movie with Dolph Lundgren had Lou Gossett Jr. playing a police officer, very similar to the Ernie Hudson character here, whose job it is to track this fairly quiet superhero through the movie.
yeah. That's very true. That's a fair point. It's a long time since I've seen the Lundgren Punisher movie. I think I've
I
only
can
seen it once.
understand.
Yeah, for sure. I think that Ernie Hudson really works in the role, and like everybody kind of really works in the role. I did see that like doing the research and stuff. Um, Basically, Ernie Hudson got the role because he was suggested by Brandon Lee. Brandon Lee and him were friends before The Crow, and
Hmm.
Brandon Lee suggested him to the director. And apparently, originally, Tony Todd, who became the Grange character, auditioned for the role. And I don't know. I guess like because Ernie Hudson has a much more kind of friendly, avuncular presence. I'm not
Great
sure.
word.
I'm not sure I see Tony Todd in the role necessarily.
Tony Todd had like a. What's the word I'm looking for? He's scary. There's a better word for it, but he has a presence.
I guess he's
It's
intimidating, but he
sinister,
doesn't. Yes,
sinister. Like
Yeah.
whereas Ernie Hudson, I don't know. It just feels like he'd look after you. Maybe that's just Ghostbusters talking, but
mm,
I don't think I don't think I've ever seen Ernie Hudson play a bad guy.
He was a bad guy in the Tom Berenger action film The Substitute from 1995, as I recall.
What a
But
pull! What a pull!
he doesn't do it a lot. I think like Ernie Hudson is like a warm presence in this movie, and
mm,
you need that because the world is so dark. And so you need
Mm.
someone that like you're drawn towards and you can understand how he can be kind of someone for the crow to talk to and rely on. I think the thing about Tony Todd is, and I have seen Tony Todd play like, you know, kind characters. Scott, you and I have seen it on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, in fact. But the thing about Tony
Kern's
Todd
not
is
warm. Oh, you mean when he plays the old Jake Sisko? Yeah,
that's
you're right.
right. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that's right.
oh,
But like, the thing about Tony Todd is there is like an edge to him and something that's slightly not trustworthy. And yes, he typically plays kind of scary villains. You know, you think of like Candyman and various other things, but like, I think you never want to question for a second through this entire movie whether you can trust the Ernie Hudson character of Albrecht. I think you need to be able to know that that is a good person. And I think with Tony Todd, you might question it.
yes, because he has that edge, and because like he is known for generally playing sinister characters, it might take you a second to kind of reset and being like, oh no, I can. Oh, this no, this is a good character, a solid character, a kind character. Yeah,
And it would have been 2 years after Candyman as well.
that's
So
true.
that might be in the audience's head.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that really is to this movie's strength is the performances throughout. And, it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, that even though some of the lines and some of the situations are absurd, everybody is taking it, everybody is committing fully.
Hmm.
And like they've just stacked it with all these like great character actors like David Patrick Kelly, like Tony Todd, like John Polito, like Michael Wincott. Like it's just like it's not like a super famous cast, but it's just a cast of great kind of like that person actors, I think.
Well, that's very much an era thing as well. Like these films didn't need to have a murderer's row of cast to sell. You just put interesting actors in the roles. But I think we're dancing around it. We haven't really spoken about the man, and that is Brandon Lee. I mean, you look at the case in point. James O'Barr, who wrote the comic, didn't want Brandon Lee because he was worried it was going to become a martial arts film.
Yeah.
And then he came on set and saw him in the makeup and saw him portraying the character, and he was like, "Damn, this is the guy." Like he just got it, and I it's a shame that like Brandon never did much else except for I think one other martial arts film, maybe a couple of other bits and bobs, and obviously the tragedy on set happened, and that was sort of the end of his career and his life, unfortunately. But by God, if he didn't leave it all on the on the I don't know on the page, that's not the right thing to say, but like he gave it his all, and he was the perfect casting for this role.
Yeah, and I mean, I've seen a couple of his other action movies from that kind of rough time period because he did Rapid Fire and Showdown in Little Tokyo. Showdown in Little Tokyo is actually with Dolph Lundgren. It's like a buddy action movie.
Mm,
Neither one would indicate to you that he was going to be on the ascent, I think, to be like a big star. They both feel kind of like they belong a little more to that Van Damme Seagal kind of school, where
sure.
it's like you're gonna have your Arnolds and your Stallones, but on the lower tier, maybe Brandon Lee would have fit in. But a movie like this, I think, is very much him kind of, building a path towards something better. And I think it is trying something a little riskier, not sticking with the I just want to make straightforward action movies. I want to do something interesting and atmospheric and work with a director who's going to create a world around me. And it really does make you wonder if he would have, going forward, been someone who would bring that physicality to any type of role, but be willing to work with directors that could utilize him. And the way that Arnold was always very smart with his collaborators, I'd like to think Brandon Lee, maybe coming off of The Crow, would have done the same thing because I think he's really terrific here, and he seems like inspired in a big way. Like he actually feels like he's raising his acting game from some of the stuff of the past as well.
I would agree with that, and I think that that was very much his template because I remember when I was doing the research when we covered Rapid Fire on the podcast, that like seeing some interviews with him, and I don't think he necessarily wanted to be like Van Damme or Seagal or, and I think like I would push back a little bit because like in Showdown in Little Tokyo, I think like you do see certainly like his comic chops. I think like
Mm,
he's very quick and I think that he kind of outpaces Dolph much in the same way that like Kurt Russell outpaces Sly and Tango and Cash. Um,
sure.
and I think that that was kind of his model because he kind of talked about that. I mean, obviously, Mel Gibson's like a problematic character, now and has been for a long time. But I remember him talking about the kind of action star he wanted to be was somebody who didn't do action all the time. It wanted to stay in the action realm, but I think he wanted to be more in the kind of Mel Gibson, Kurt Russell, kind of Harrison Ford mold of somebody who did other projects and stretched their acting chops, but came back to action quite often. And I think he wanted to be more in that realm rather than your Arnie's, your Slies, your Van Dammes, your Segals.
And to work with strong directors, which is
Yes.
something that Mel Gibson and Harrison Ford did. And I do give Arnold a lot of credit for that, though, because Arnold was someone who very easily could have made raw deals his entire career, but was someone who said, hey, I want to work with people like James Cameron, Ivan Reitman, people that are going to push me and challenge me. And yeah, I mean, I don't, as you're saying, like maybe Brandon Lee didn't want to be the next Arnold Schwarzenegger, but he had kind of the similar motivations of like, I want to be, surrounded by talent and to work my way up and improve what I can do on screen.
Yeah. And I think like he was possibly also conscious of like I think that obviously he was a martial artist, but I do think he was also conscious of he wanted to create a like a different persona to his father,
Mm.
and not just do the kind of martial art movies, and kind of kind of stretch himself in more in the acting realm and kind of differentiate himself, which I think certainly from this movie, I think he could have got a lot from this movie because I do think that in this film he does stretch his acting chops way further than he does in Rapid Fire and Showdown in Little Tokyo, which is only other kind of two major motion pictures. Um, and I think like he really manages to balance kind of everything that's going on here from the kind of uh, grieving his partner and the kind of emotion of that, but also doing kind of the hard boiled action stuff and also doing kind of the kind of funny kind of one liners and like the kind of funny bits that he does as well, like when he's taunting Fun Boy, and that kind of Jesus gag that he gives there, and things like that that are kind of meant to be funny moments. I think he delivers on them as well. So I think it's a pretty kind of all round performance that he gives that kind of points to a bright future that we sadly never saw.
I can't be the
It's
only one that thought of Heath Ledger's Joker
I
watching
was
this,
literally
right?
about to
Yes,
mention
yes.
exactly that. That was my
Yeah,
next point
Yeah.
because
because
I've not
like,
got the history that you two have.
Uh-huh.
So
sure.
I kind of like there's a scene in this film, for instance, where the crow comes in and meets the room full of mafia people, right? All the
Mm-hmm.
baddies around the table, and he
Yep.
might as well have had a grenade on a pull string in his jacket pocket because it. Heath Ledger must have been taking copious amounts of notes from The Crow going into that performance as the Joker because that is not exactly scene for scene the exact thing, but the intention is there.
Yeah, and I remember when they unveiled how Heath Ledger's Joker would look, a lot of people online were quite critical, saying it just looked like The Crow.
Mm.
And it's so weird because in the years since, all they ever talk about really is like Tom Waits being an influence on Heath Ledger, and then the shark from Jaws or Alex from Clockwork Orange. I've never really heard them specifically say The Crow, which I don't know how that's possible. There's so many moments in this where the crow pops into a room and says something to a villain in kind of like a kind of odd, kind of almost like dark comic way that I'm like, this feels almost like the way the Joker would deliver lines in The Dark Knight.
Yeah,
I'm not sure I would agree that it's in his delivery necessarily, or at least for me. For me, it's
mm,
more the physicality of how he's moving. I
Yeah.
see that in the Joker. Like maybe it's the outfit which ties into it too, but just sort of that. Yeah, especially you talk about like when he does like he gets shot on that table. I was talking about that scene,
mhm.
like how he just like pratfalls down, he kind of rolls around, and he gets very loose with the fact that he is invincible. Like he isn't rigid, and he's quite he flows, and the Joker has that kind of fluidity to him too. And I just think that I think the way that Heath carried his Joker comes a lot from Brandon Lee's The Crow.
That's
Yeah, it's I guess what I'm thinking of the way he'll sometimes toss off a quip felt very Jokerish in this.
I Yeah, I felt the same as you, Cam. I think that like the way because like obviously because he's traumatized by the rape and the murder of his fiance, like I think it goes to the kind of state of mind that he kind of delivers a lot of his lines in this kind of half cracked way. That I feel is quite similar to the Joker. Like it's there's a kind of manicness to it that I feel has a similar energy and vibe that you get from Heath Ledger's Joker.
Yeah, it's just I've never understood how that wasn't at some point like just a reference point. There's so many things that go into informing a performance, but I just don't buy that at no point Heath Ledger didn't watch The Crow.
And just in terms of symbolism, it's nice to see that Skarsgård is taking notes from Jared Leto's Joker now.
He's damaged.
Oh no. So I guess maybe we can briefly talk about the remake, the trailer of the remake, and the reaction to it, which has been poor. I do. I mean, Bill Skarsgård did well as Pennywise.
Hmm.
Like he's not a terrible performer. Um, but
He's good in John Wick 4 as well.
he
I
is.
can't wait for his Nosferatu. I'm just counting down to it.
Yeah, yeah, no, that looks great. So like, but this, I'm not sure, and it does look like they're pulling more. They're going to add element. I mean, from the trailer, it looks like they're going to add elements that aren't in this movie, and in terms of like being guided through the kind of netherworld, the kind of the land of the undead. Because like in this film, there was supposed to be a character called the Skull Cowboy
Hmm.
who was going to be portrayed by Michael Berryman of the Hills
Yeah.
Have Eyes fame. But apparently it was Brandon Lee's call. Apparently he said to the director and the producers that he wanted to make it that he was the only supernatural presence in the film. He thought it might overload it by having like
Mm.
more
I
supernatural presences. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I had just to the contrary of your point, but again, this is hearsay and just I think IMDb trivia at this point, which
Mm-hmm.
hard to give any sort of factual credibility to those things. But I'd read that they had shot scenes with this chap, but it was the subplot of having him sort of lead him through this new life that he has taken as the Crow was cut because of a lot of that would have. There were some shots that would have been done on those last few days where Brandon had passed.
That is
They weren't
that's
able to
right.
do.
That's right. So I have read so I've read conflicting accounts because like I've read that which suggests that like it would have been in the film if Brandon had not tragically been accidentally killed on set. But then I was also reading another kind of behind the scenes kind of article that suggested that it was Brandon Lee kind of suggested that to take these other parts out and the kind of other supernatural characters. So I'm not sure what the truth of the matter is. Yeah.
Hmm. I'm actually okay cutting that type of character. It's like that trope sometimes can feel a little tired. I think of like the Sam Elliott in Ghost Rider character.
Right.
But I guess it worked okay with Whistler in the Blade films.
Yeah, I mean that's a good example of it really working for sure. Yeah, 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 yeah. I think like yeah, I think that there's it's interesting as well, like kind of going back to what we're talking about with the kind of look of the film. Like watching this film again, it is kind of something that I miss that I think has kind of been brought back in some films more recently. That it's a comic book film that looks like a comic book,
Mm-hmm.
and then
Yeah.
obviously they decided that what was wrong with comic book movies after the success of X-Men is that they looked like comic books, so they stopped making films that looked like comic books.
Yeah. Except for the spirit.
Which is a terrible, terrible film and not a good advertisement.
You've really got it in for the spirit this episode, haven't you, Cam? What did Alec Baldwin do to you?
No, that's
No,
not the
that's a
spirit.
shadow.
That's
That's
the
a
shadow.
shadow.
Oh,
That's a
sorry.
shadow. No, The Spirit is a movie from 2008, which I think people were excited for because it was like, oh, Frank Miller did all right co-directing The Sin City. He's
Yeah.
a good comic book writer, and people got kind of hyped for it. And Samuel L. Jackson's in it. It's going to be great. And then people went to see it, and it was very not. It is truly one of the worst comic book movies. Like yes.
I'll take Howard the Duck over the spirit any day.
I would also take Howard the Duck over the Spirit. Like I mean, I don't know if there's many comic book movies that are worse than it. Maybe Steel or the
Yeah.
or the David Hasselhoff Nick Fury TV film.
Scott, do you have
We,
something to say about that?
I recently watched that for the first time for a Patreon episode. That was a miserable hour and a half of my life.
Oh, yeah. I mean, well, kudos to you for getting through it. I mean,
I wish my decoy body could have watched it instead of me, you know?
There's also a really bad Man Thing film from the 2000s, but
okay.
like I too also like you missed like that time period where it was like, how do we create a comic book world? And when you're talking about, Batman 89 into movies like this, it's like, how do we do it through a lot of practical effects? We've got models and like incredible sets, great cinematography. It wasn't just like, I don't know, just CG it. And there's something about just how tangible these worlds feel that I just love to get absorbed into. And I'm sure it'll bounce back the other way at some point. This kind of like generic world of the MCU gets a little old. So, like, going back to a movie like this is so refreshing. And as much as I can say, yes, it doesn't necessarily like shoot you through the story, I kind of don't care because I like hanging out in these places.
Yeah, for sure. And I did think like it was maybe going to come back because there was like elements of it in like Guardians of the Galaxy and like Thor Ragnarok, which is kind of like Kirby-esque and
Hmm.
but it never like fully came through. It was kind of they just went back to that's like the exception to the norm. So but I thought at that stage it might have popped back up, but didn't really quite. I think like the other things we've got to talk about is it first of all, as much as Brandon Lee's performance is great, Brandon Lee was also did the fight choreography alongside regular John Carpenter collaborator Jeff Amada, who was the stunt coordinator and co-fight choreographer. And I think the action's really good. And I think, again, speaking to it being very of the time, this is the kind of period of the 90s. Obviously, the year before, we had Hard Target, which was the first American John Woo movie. And this is the kind of period of the 90s where we start to see Hong Kong action seep into Hollywood action, and particularly the kind of shootout at the when the scene we've mentioned before where he jumps down on the table, and then we get the big shootout with the mafia guys. I think that's a great scene. I think it's very kind of John Woo kind of influenced. And I was wondering what you thought purely of the action in the movie that takes place.
Well, you just replace doves with crows.
Exactly.
It's perfect. I mean, the action is great. The bit that really caught me was very early on because the opening looks okay, but there's a certain sense of a low budget. Like you see the sort of cityscape, and it's great. It looks great for the time, but you just get a feeling that something feels a bit cheap. But then you get to that hand-to-hand combat fight with the knife.
Yeah.
He's like catching it in midair and then ducking around it and things like that and throwing it back at him. And it's just like it's very creative. It's something that I hadn't really seen particularly, and it just felt propulsive. Like it didn't pull back. I guess is really what I'm trying to say. Like a lot of the gunshots and stuff, yeah, it's quite visceral.
Yeah, and you mentioned, Jeff Amata worked on a lot of the action in this, and he
Yep.
was a big part of the Bourne films as well
Hmm.
in putting that action
Right.
together. We've covered all the Bourne films on our podcast, and he's definitely like the go-to guy if you want to push the envelope and take action to new interesting places. And Scott references that knife scene that really jumped out to me in that it felt kind of like quirky and it felt like something that I didn't typically see in movies of this time period.
Mhm.
Whereas like when I see the shootout at the table, that's the one moment maybe in the whole movie where the action feels very influenced by something else, because I too was thinking of the John Woo films to come and then the ones he'd done previously like The Killer and Hard Boiled.
Mhm.
But the other action around it, kind of the more the one-on-one stuff, I think of course as well with the guy with the needles, that feels more like these little mini like set pieces of kind of they're all kind of strange. They don't have your straightforward 90s action feel to them or late 80s action feel to them. They feel like they're kind of like infused with like a comic energy, even if it's not necessarily haha funny.
Well, it's that hyper realism I mentioned earlier. Everything is just turned up slightly higher. It maybe let's just say 11 if we want the Spinal Tap reference.
Which we
Is it
always do.
RoboCop? Yeah, of course. We got to take it to 11. Yeah. Is it like kind of that RoboCop factor of like just cranking that ultra violence up that extra degree to almost like a slight level of absurdity?
Yeah, I think
You're
it. Sorry, go ahead, Scott.
no, go on, Scott.
No, I was just going to say I think it is that kind of cranking up and kind of taking it to that kind of like an almost like a feverish level. I think it's like what I said before about he stabbed him in every major organ in alphabetical order. Like everything seems to be just that little bit overkill, and I guess again that speaks to the kind of vibe of the movie of like this is a traumatized guy on a path of bloody vengeance, and it's not really about seeking justice necessarily. It's just about pure bloody revenge.
Well, it's also, I mean, this is just a casual observation for me, but
Yep.
cinema took a bit of a shift around about 2002 because of the events of 2001.
Hmm.
And it started to have to sort of apologize for its own violence a lot of the time. Like
Hmm.
I had to pull back and had to give your protagonist a reason to be doing it instead of just being sort of hyper violent. And then you go back to like the 80s and you've got like Rambo First Blood Part 2 and he's just shooting up the joint. And there's no excuse for it. It's just what Rambo does. And so this is somewhere in between the two. But I guess sort of what we're enjoying here is that it's just violent for the enjoyment of seeing a violent film. Like it isn't holding back, and we're just enjoying it for what it is. And we haven't really seen this come back until I think the John Wick films have sort of begun to bring that back into popularity. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, isn't Chad Stahelski part of this film?
Yes, so
Yes.
Chad Stahelski was Brandon Lee's body double, and this was the first time I've read is the first time in movie history where somebody's face was digitally placed, and so there's some reshoots that Brandon Lee obviously could not do because of his tragic passing. And they are done by Chad Stahelski, and there's some digital replacement work, face work in the movie. So yes, that is correct. I think that to your point that it depends on the reality you're creating, because I think some people still get away with it in the sense of like as long as you're creating like a hyper stylized reality. I mean, I guess like the first movie that came to my head, like kind of post 2002, is like something like Kill Bill, where as long as you're creating like a kind of hyper
Mm-hmm.
stylized reality, you can still have that kind of ironic violence.
Yeah, and I remember actually it was that early 2000s that kind of did Arnold in.
Yes.
Post 9/11, they didn't know how to handle like Arnold movies, and I remember in particular Collateral Damage. was just kicked around the release schedule and just did no business at all, because at that point they're like, what Arnold offers no longer has a place in this world.
Yeah. I think that's true. And I think like maybe because they it's not done in maybe it's the tone of it, like because it's not done in that kind of Tarantino kind of ironic way, and if you're doing it in a kind of more earnest way, it comes across more disturbing because people can't detach from the violence in the same way that they can from a that kind of Tarantino lens.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I also think someone like Tarantino, by the point of Kill Bill, had a big enough profile that he could do whatever he wanted. And
Mhm.
he's more the exception rather than the rule. Whereas in the 80s, I think it was the other way around. Like if you had an action film in the 1980s, I think it's harder to get away with without the violence.
Yeah,
Like it's
Yeah.
almost relied upon.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess, but like, I guess that's true. I guess that's true. But I think like as well that there's a number of like kind of kind of hyper real films in the 2000s that kind of get away with more violence. A lot of them are kind of the kind of Tarantino type influence ones, like your Smoking Aces and your Lucky Number 11s and stuff like that. And
Mm-hmm.
then also something like Shoot 'Em Up as well, which again takes place in a completely cartoon reality. Actually, far more detached from reality than even this film is.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah, where it became more of, or Crank
Or
actually
Crank,
as well,
yes,
like
or
the
Crank, yeah,
the Jason Statham stuff, where when it went, because Jason Statham was obviously making like the Transporter movies and things like that,
yeah.
but it was like Crank was the one where you could go ultra violent, but you had to keep it absurd.
Yes. So as long as you gave it that kind of yeah, absurdist, over the top, kind of ironic kind of way, yes, that then it's okay culturally. It was okay, but I think like it's interesting. I think like even going into the 2010s, we even kind of pull back from that a little bit because I think the 2000s had a uh, gave irony a greater license than we do now. Um, but I think that's like a conversation for a whole different podcast.
I mean, that's the decade of like Meet the Spartans. So what? Who are we to talk
uh,
about it? Like
Uh,
what a terrible time.
and the
yeah,
era of the PG-13 action film as well.
Mm.
yeah, yeah. Meet this. Thanks for reminding of all of that. Um, yeah. Yeah. I think.
We've interviewed the dad of one of the writers
Oh,
in a
okay.
very it's a very small connection, but like he actually it connects to our name. The dad of one of the writers of Meet the Spartans wrote Spy Hard
And
Oh,
directed
okay.
Spy Hard.
and directed Spy Hard. You're right. Thank you, Cam.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think those writers, because they also wrote, obviously epic movie and date movie,
Hmm.
and disaster movie. I think there might be the worst thing that's ever happened to comedy. Um,
Or film.
Well, I think it killed that brand of comedy film.
yes, I think the parody film was killed by them single-handed, well, double-handedly.
I mean, it was on the way down with Scary Movie and stuff like that. Even that
Yeah.
had a little bit of like a little bit of edge to it that you could enjoy, but I feel like that was the beginning of the slope. Spy Hard wasn't great, and I think the other Leslie Nielsen film around the time, the there was like it was the Fugitive knockoff. What was that one
Wrongfully
called?
Oh,
accused.
wrongfully accused.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Mm.
and it's just like it's just getting bad, and then it just starts to slide off from there.
Yeah, because that period of Leslie Nielsen's painfully, but because even as much as I love Mel Brooks, obviously Dracula Dead and Loving It is just a comedy black hole. So, sorry, Mel. Um, yes. How do we get back to the Crow from this? Who
I got
knows?
an answer for that. There's actually an
Okay,
answer to that, because we're talking about Leslie Nielsen, and in 1994 he was on the top of the world with Naked Gun 33 and a third, which was right behind The Crow at the box office, right? Is that right?
that is absolutely correct. That is
Boom.
absolutely correct.
That's why we pay Cam the big bucks.
That is. That is. I mean, that's why I got the extra budget for this particular episode to bring him in.
Wait,
Um,
Cam's being paid.
Oh,
Oh,
I'm sorry to
Ah.
inform you at this point in the podcast, Scott. But you know, he's brought us gold like that, so like he's been worth the munching.
Hey, it's fine.
What I do.
He's
Uh,
he's contractually obliged to give me 33 and a third of all of his earnings anyway. So
well, that's yes, indeed, indeed. We're bringing it all back. That's amazing. I think like the other thing. Oh, there's a couple other things that we should really talk about. What should we do first? Okay, let's talk about we've talked about some of the performances. One of the performances we've not talked about is Michael Wincott as Top Dollar, who is one. I will put it down right now. One of the best villains in a '90s action movie, and Michael Wincott is just amazing. Like he's amazing as the kind of top henchman in Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. He's
Yeah.
amazing doing the exact same role in Three Musketeers, and he's even more amazing in this movie as Top Dollar. That's what I'm gonna say about it. What are your thoughts on Michael Wincott?
well, I read that there was a high amount of cocaine use on this set. And what
No.
well, and when I think of cocaine use on the set of The Crow, I think of Michael Wincott. Because you have to be on something to give that performance.
He was Michael Wynn cutting lines.
Oh.
Oh, oh, indeed, indeed. Like when he's got that big plate of cocaine in front of him, that was entirely real.
It was
He,
very
he,
Scarface.
he was paying top dollar for that coke.
Oh, dear.
Oh, that's good. I mean, the thing
Oh,
about Michael Wincott is he has so many scenes where it's just, him and Bai Ling or him and another co-star. And I had to like really take a second to think like in previous superhero-ish movies like this, you would have like Jack Nicholson, Al
mhm.
Pacino, like some of the greatest actors of their generation dominating scenes kind of where they just talk to a heavy for a period of time.
Yeah.
But like Michael Wincott does not have the stature that they do, but he holds the screen every time he's there. He's so reliable as a villain. He always brings an interesting quality to whatever he's doing. And he has, I really think, we were talking about Heath Ledger being inspired by the Crow character. I can't help but think that Steven Dorff was looking at this character when he was, figuring out Deacon Frost for Blade.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I have to say, like, watching like it must have been crazy on set watching Michael Wincott's performance. I just feel like, particularly at the big table scene where he's like talking to Skank, one of the goons, and Skank, he asks him how he's feeling, and he says he feels like a little warm on a big fucking hook, and then Michael Wincott repeats the line in the most insane way that I feel like the rest of the table are like, holy fuck.
Can someone explain to me what Top Dollar's business operation is? Because
Oh,
I'm a little question. I have a lot of questions about that one.
I have no idea. Because like there is a moment at the big table where he says like how he's getting bored with all the buildings burning down and all that kind of stuff. And he says, it used to be fine. The buildings burn. We all make some money. And I'm like, I have questions. How do you all make some money? It's like, do you own all the buildings? Is it an insurance scam? Wouldn't the insurance stop paying out at a certain point because like it happens every year? Like, yeah, I was very confused by his criminal empire. And I've never worked it out. And I've seen this movie a lot. Cam, you have also seen this movie quite a few times. Any answers?
I got nothing. It's the
Okay.
classic case of the 89 Joker who just sits in a room all day and things are apparently happening around him and he's apparently very successful.
Yes. Got it. Yeah, no. So I'm sorry, Scott. We got nothing for you. Apparently.
It's okay. It's okay.
Yeah. And I don't
I mean,
know.
I will just throw in,
Uh-huh.
it's sort of semi-connected, but one thing I really love about this film is, and I think it's a really underused concept, is the idea of, I had to write it down because I thought it was so cool. What is it
Mhm.
called? Devil's Night.
Oh yeah.
Devil's Night.
Like,
Yeah.
why has there not been a spin-off about Devil's Night? Kind of like what's it called, that series of films where like everyone can go out and cause crime for an
The
evening?
Purge is called
Yeah.
the Purge films.
It's like the Purge before the Purge happened. They should have a spin-off about what happens on Devil's Night stays on Devil's Night. I'd watch that.
Would you?
No.
I was gonna say, I know you. You're not the biggest like horror movie guy. There's no way you're running out to see
Cam would
Devil's
watch
Night.
that.
I would. Yes, I would.
Thank you.
Maybe they really tap into the mythology of Devil's Night on the Stairway to Heaven TV show. I don't know.
Mm.
Yeah. So apparently Devil's Night is kind of a real thing. So I looked into it, and I originally, when I was a kid, when I first saw this movie, I thought, oh, this Devil's Night is like they've created this like cool like kind of nightmarish thing, but no, apparently this Devil's Night is associated with October the 30th, the night before Halloween in Detroit, Michigan. And especially from the late 60s to the 90s, involved widespread serious vandalism and arson in the Detroit area.
Wow.
The community responded by promoting Angels Night, a peaceful alternative beginning in the 90s. The rates of arson began to fall thanks in parts to these community programs. So it's actually based on real life. I mean, taken to the ultimate degree, I guess, but but yes, it's based on a real phenomenon.
So what you're saying is you want us to bring back Devil's Night?
For legal reasons, please state to confirm that is exactly what you're telling us to do.
Note for the lawyers, I am not promoting arson and vandalism in the Detroit metropolitan area. These words were never uttered from my mouth. I think that will be good enough. Hopefully, I don't get any letter from the governor of Michigan complaining about this podcast and its promotion of Devil's Night as if it's a cool thing.
Think of the PR you'll get though. Downloads will skyrocket, I tell you that.
I mean, like, yeah. So this started as like a 90s action movie nostalgia podcast, and instead we're bringing back something from the 90s. But it's terrible vandalism.
It's arson.
And arson.
We're bringing back arson.
Bringing back arson from the 90s. Something that community groups, worked hard to stop, but we're bringing it back and destroying the Detroit metropolitan area.
Folks, we don't endorse arsony. Arsony? Arson either. Or arsony or arson. Neither. Don't do it.
Don't do it. If you're listening to this podcast and you live in the Detroit metropolitan area, please do not go out on October 30th.
Don't specify to Detroit. Worldwide, folks.
Worldwide. We don't promote
do
arson. We don't promote arson on this podcast at all. Whether you're in Detroit or whether you're anywhere else in the world, like here in Wellington or London or Vancouver, like, where we're podcasting from. Anywhere.
Coming up next week on the show, Backdraft.
Thankfully, we've already covered Backdraft. Which if people have not seen it and have not listened to the episode, check that out, and also be reminded that Backdraft is one of the most insanely structured films you'll ever see. Because people forget that it is a family drama stroke action movie stroke kind of Silence of the Lamb knockoff. Like it's a bunch of things. Stroke political conspiracy thriller. It's one of the weirdest films, which you just think is like a standard action film. It's very strange. Anyway, I guess we should get. So I think we would be remiss if we didn't briefly talk about the soundtrack for The Crow, which I think, I guess because like I'm a rock and metal fan, I think it's high up there with like the Matrix soundtrack, with like the Natural Born Killers soundtrack as one of the best soundtracks of the 90s. I'm going to put that out there. I don't know if you have similar feelings either. Cam or Scott?
I don't think I could weigh into it too much because I've only just watched it for the first time today. But
Uh-huh.
I did notice stuff like The Cure and Nine Inch Nails on there. And I've just pulled it up the list in front of me, and it's got a lot of bands I do enjoy. So I think I might actually give this a listen through tomorrow. But I'd be more keen to hear from Cam on this one.
I'm not as big on like grunge music, so
Mhm.
like that stuff doesn't necessarily grab me as much. But like Nine Inch Nails, the song "Dead Souls," I absolutely love. I'm a huge Nine Inch Nails fan, and that whole sequence of the crow running across the rooftops to that music, I'm like, oh, glorious! And just like the live
Yeah.
music performances in the movie as well, I thought were just fantastic. Um, there's an energy that comes from that era that it's dead now. Let's be honest, it's completely dead.
Yeah.
um this is a world where the goth clubs of my early 20s still exist and I can go back to and be very happy.
I I guess so. Like yeah, that whole scene and vibe, that's very much a thing in the past. I do think it makes a good job of like mixing because there's not a massive amount of grunge on it. I mean, the Stone Temple Pilots are on the soundtrack, but I think it mainly more veers towards kind of the metal stuff with
Hmm.
Nine Inch Nails and Pantera and Helmets on there. Um, yeah. So I guess like the two performances in the club that are more are more grungy, I guess. Like for they're bands I'm not so familiar with, Medicine and I can never remember the name of the other band who performs in the club because they've got like a long name.
Is that
Uh
My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult?
yeah, My Life Through the Silk Cult. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. That's the one. Um so yeah. But I definitely think if you are a fan of rock or metal of that period, I think I think it's great. And then it's not just kind of metal as well. Like I think the montage that we get, the kind of makeup and tooling up montage to the Cure's Burn, I think
Mm.
is very cool. And again, like we've kind of been saying, kind of very much places it in time. This is very much a kind of time capsule movie, and everything that was cool in 1994 was infused in this film. So yeah.
I
So
think
I.
also like the music informs this movie
Mhm.
far more successfully and creates like the world of the movie in a way that Batman 89 didn't really succeed quite as well with the Prince music. Where it's like it's some of those songs are really great and it's fun to see Jack Nicholson dance around to them, but they don't feel like Batman 89 doesn't really feel like a world created by Prince music, whereas The Crow feels like a world created by a lot of the music usage here.
Yes, I think so. I think you're right that there was like a perfect marriage between what's happening on screen and the soundtrack in a way that some films don't have. Like one of the films that we covered last year is a movie called Judgment Night,
Oh yeah.
which is a solid movie and has like for metal fans has a really iconic kind of rap metal, rap rock kind of soundtrack, and it's clunkily placed, and it feels like they don't quite know what to do with the soundtrack. The soundtrack feels cooler than the movie, whereas this is a better marriage of soundtrack and visual image, for sure. I would definitely agree with that.
Well, it definitely feels like it started with the origins of what they like the story they wanted to tell versus some
Mhm.
of the other ones that felt a little more slapped on after the fact.
Yes, yeah, and maybe that's partly to do with like Alex Proyas's background in music video, and like maybe he had a greater role in the curation of the soundtrack than maybe another director would. I certainly know from like doing the research in that Judgment Night episode, the director had like no real interest in like rap or metal or anything like that, and was just kind of given this soundtrack. I was like, okay.
Right.
So I think like there might have been a greater connection there between the director's involvement with the soundtrack.
And I think
Um.
the soundtrack's influential because you see it on the other Crow films, but even
Oh
something like
yeah.
Spawn as well. The Spawn soundtrack was a big deal where they did an ambitious project where it was mashing up metal artists with electronic artists. and it's a crazy album, but like I would have real questions as to whether the director of Spawn was like, this is my vision for this film.
That is true. That is true. I'm not sure that we got his vision of I think the vision went wrong.
It began and ended with the cape.
Yeah, yeah, and I don't know. So many things went wrong with that movie. I feel sorry for Michael Jai White, like because he is great. He's great in many things, but that I feel like that was his kind of big opportunity to his big showcase, and obviously it didn't do anything for him. Even though he's obviously done great things, particularly in the DTV realm. But
Definitely.
he could have if it just been a bit better movie, maybe he could have had like a bit bigger career.
He did get to share a scene with the Joker though in The Dark Knight, so you got that.
He did. We're connecting all the dots today, for sure. So I guess like that just really leaves it to kind of like anything that we didn't mention that you particularly wanted to bring up, or any kind of final thoughts you have on the Crow. We'll go with Scott first, since you're the one that who is seen it for the first time with the freshest eyes.
I got a note, and I'm going to cough. Sorry. I've got a note and a sort of final thought, I suppose I'll add. The note is a white cat called Gabriel. It's on the nose. I like that.
It is, yes.
And what my final note on this was, can we swear on this podcast?
Yes, I mark all the episodes as explicit. Yeah, so you're all good.
I wrote down teenage me would have fucking loved this film. I mean, I was dressing like in full black leather jackets because of the Matrix, and this is like inject this into my veins. This is exactly the vibe I was looking for. My angsty teenage years. So I very much enjoyed it as an adult. I think it really would have done the business for me if I'd watched it when I was about 15, 16.
Yeah, I totally agree, because like I was very into the Matrix. I was very into metal. I was very into grunge. I was all those things. You know, like you, I was also watching wrestling at the time. I also thought Crow Sting was very cool. So like yes, all of it works for me. And yeah, I think that's where my love of the film comes from, because I saw it at the exact correct time when I was like 14, 15 years old. So Cam, what your final thoughts, or any notes that you feel like we've been remiss in not saying?
Well, I think I'll just say like Bai Ling is a very memorable unhinged performance in this movie, and I have never forgotten ever since the moment I saw the movie the scene where the crow takes her eyes out. Like horrific. Horrific. So that has definitely stuck with me. The other thing I had was a question. So this is like a gothic action movie. So this kind of goes hand in hand with the movie, but would this movie have ended with a church bell tower and a roof fight were it not for Batman 89?
Yeah, probably not. Yeah, I know what you mean. I think you know, like, as we've discussed throughout the podcast, they're definitely drawing from a bunch of elements here, whether it be some of the Burton stuff, or some of the John Woo stuff, or you know, some of the stuff that just comes from kind of the music videos, particularly rock music videos of the time. So I would suggest that you're correct in your assumption that the finale of Batman influenced the finale here.
Well, are we discounting the graphic novels? Not that I've read it, but did that not have the same? I mean, did that not influence the final battle? Was there also a church in that?
I can't
Um,
answer that one.
I have read the graphic novel, but I've not read it in a while, and
Ooh.
I
One for
can't,
the listeners.
I can't remember. I can't remember. I will need to reread the graphic novel. I would say there is. I mean, the graphic novel is different to the or because like one, there's more supernatural elements, and two, the graphic novel is. I think that the movie inserts like a really dark humor. It is more there's more levity in this movie than there is in the novel. Like the no, I would say the graphic novel is even bleaker, even more
Mm.
kind of emo than the movie. Although I do really like the graphic novel, and it's a while since I've reread it, so like I can't remember if the finale takes place on top of a on top of a church, which I feel really bad about because I've read it a few times.
Fair
um,
enough.
um,
But I will say, like, that's not a criticism of the movie if it is
yeah.
taking that from Batman. One of the things I like about this movie ultimately is that as much as we could sit there and point in different things, Tim Burton, Batman,
Yeah.
MTV, all that stuff, it doesn't really matter. It is a kind of perfect amalgamation of 1994 pop culture in a package that feels unique. When you see Brandon Lee walk through this movie as the Crow, that is a visual that sticks with you, and the world around him feels unique and interesting, even if it is drawing on all these various influences. Doesn't matter at the end of the day.
Yeah. No, I would absolutely agree with that. And to go to like an earlier point you were making in summation there. I think that Scott that proves that not everybody needs cocaine because I've seen Bai Ling in many films and she's always like that. Um
True.
so so not everybody needs drugs to be that way. Um so yeah, I guess like we've covered the Crow. I mean, like the only thing I would say to listeners if they've not seen it, I would say check it out. I feel like it's a great movie. I think Brandon Lee's performance is great. I think the action's great. I think it's full of like kind of iconic lines and like I think even if you've not seen it, the things like when he burns the crow symbol and certain moments in the movie are him kind of working through the rooftops to kind of running through the rooftop. There's certain things the is that gasoline I smell kind of line, and there's certain things that are really I feel it's all great. I think that maybe there is in terms of the actual plot or whatever it's actually it's relatively thin, and you could say it's style over substance. But I love it because it's such wonderful style, and I think yeah, that's my final tuppence on the matter.
Hmm.
So it just leaves me to thank thank you very much, Scott and Cam, for coming on this episode of The Crow. I hope you enjoyed talking about it as much as I did. And yes, please do tell us what's coming up on SpyHards. Give promote anything you want. The Patreon, all your social media details. Just plug away.
Scott,
Oh, it's over to me again.
swing
No,
away.
swing away. No pressure. Well, I have a rough idea of when this episode is coming out, so I'll give you a little taste of what's coming out around the month of August for Spy Hards. It's a party month for us. We've got a bit of a theme going on. But the first thing we're doing is celebrating the release of Wolverine and Deadpool with a review of X-Men First Class, which is kind of a spy film in of itself. So we're doing a little bit of an X-Men film there. And then we're following that up with an interview, a very exclusive interview with Miss Lana Wood. Plenty O'Toole from Diamonds Are Forever. A big interview coming there. She is utterly fantastic. Some great stories of working with Sean Connery. It is not one to miss out. And if you don't want to miss out, you can basically find us everywhere you look for podcasts. SpyHards, SpyHards. I'm sure there'll be links in the show notes below. And fortunately, we have that Twitter handle, Instagram handle, TikTok handle everywhere as well at SpyHards, SpyHards. And I'll stop talking now.
I think like that's a fabulous job you did of the promotion there, Scott. And I do feel that maybe you need a higher percentage of Cam's check now that
Hey.
you've delivered so well.
I've been saying it for years.
I didn't agree to this.
Yeah.
But thank you for having us on the show, Scott. It's been an absolute pleasure for me, experiencing The Crow for the first time. I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to do so. I'm sure, and I can speak on behalf of Cam, but we've had a blast.
Yeah, and I always appreciate any opportunity to talk about a movie that's not a spy movie on a podcast because that's kind of like the regular gig. So it's always fun to tackle something like this.
Excellent. Well, it's been great having you on, and I think the last thing for me to say is just that this episode is now officially over. We now head back from the 90s back into the present day, and join us again next month. I think, like the previous month, I said that we would be covering Clear and Present Danger, and surprise, we're covering The Crow. But actually, because of the switcheroo with all the release dates for the Crow remake, we thought we would align it with that. So we're talking about The Crow. And then, so next month in September, we will talk about Clear and Present Danger. So join us then. Until next time, though, see you.